see if it's how usable it is for the audience. So agenda about why cloud, focus on the viable, minimum versus minimum, code keeps eating the world, and compliance as code. Little bit about myself. So I'm the solution architect for Standard Chartered. I'm an ex-Pivotal, ex-JP Morgan, Bank of America, ex-Adobe. I organized the DevOps Days Singapore. It's coming back for the 4th year on the 11th and 12th of October. So definitely, okay, am I audible? Okay.
Use the handheld microphone.
No, I think it's this is for the recording.
That's right.
Okay, great. What else? Yeah, if you're on LinkedIn or on Twitter, yep, please get in touch. What is DevOps? So how many of you think that this is a title? How many of you are DevOps engineers? Okay, well, a few. How many of you think this is automation? So you're like automation engineers? No automation engineers. How many of you think this is about culture? So you're like in the Scrum, Agile. Okay, and the rest of you, I guess you build software. You just build software. That's great. And that's very important because a lot of the financial services in this industry have started looking at outsourcing their IT mainly to the service providers like the cloud and they are looking at infrastructure service, container service, platform as a service, software as a service. And it's really important to understand what you're buying in, what you're responsible, and then what's your unit of scale. So for example, if you are in the container, you scale the containers, but you still need to take care of all the runtimes and small, just enough operating system. Whereas if you are doing like a function as a service, then you just scaling the functions and you are responsible of the business logic. So the analogy that I like to use is the car as a service. So if you think of like the cloud is very much like hiring a taxi. So it's available. You can hire it via an app. It's flexible. You can stop, drop, change direction wherever you want. You pay at the distance as much as you go. And most importantly, you don't need to have a garage or like a car park. You don't need to to pay for the parking lot. So immediately there's that opportunity in terms of, well, I actually think that we can focus on our core system, like writing our function, like the core banking, or if you're like in a retail, you write your catalog and you search, or if you're a media company, you write your movie and the service for recording. And forget about the Jiras and don't reinvent the databases or the middleware. Just buy it. Just buy it. So definitely make a conclusion what's your core business and what's undifferentiating heavy lifting, as Amazon used to say. So really the importance of why we want to go on this cloud is you get infrastructure as code. So you no longer need to rack and stack the servers. You don't need to plug in the electricity. You don't need to care about the cooling, the temperature. You don't have people in the data center who will reply to the message. You start having this developer sandboxing because it's all API driven. You can stand up a developer workstation anywhere in the world, in every region that you have your team. You can start doing these environments, these logical environments, because don't forget, cloud is the same for everyone. So it's actually a logical concept for you. If you are on AWS, your production and development will run on the same hardware. So actually, you decide what are the controls and what is the underlying platform. Well, containerization and microservices, that's very much dependent. It really depends how mature in your organization and if you're doing domain-driven design, event streaming, and really like, is it the core business or you just started writing some microservices purely because it's easy and we just like write a hello world application in 4 hours and we get it to the production. Actually, production systems, the hardest part is keeping them, having real customers, maintaining them for years. Failover, auto-scaling. The next part is really in terms of, well, so we really like the value in the cloud. So how do we migrate to cloud? And there's multiple assessments, there's multiple research reports. I just picked the City Hub, which is giving you a white paper on how to migrate to cloud. And you start with, well, what applications do we want to migrate? And it starts with the technology. Then they go into, well, so is there a business justification or there's funding? Okay. What's the best technical approach? That means, are there available frameworks? Is the staff or the team knowledgeable in that particular framework? And I'll skip at the last, and then we say, well, what is the security and compliance risk or obligations we need to be addressed? And if you launched a product, a financial product, and you want to sell it in Indonesia, well, you actually cannot use public cloud. You need to onshore it. You cannot use AWS or GCP for that perspective. So you are at the square one, or square zero, and you need to re-architect. You need to understand how you're going to migrate the whole application now, rewrite it from scratch. You cannot use the building blocks that you had on AWS. You just need to, and probably some people will be fired if you haven't put in your top list. Next. So when I talk about cloud risk and security and concerns, what do I actually mean? So there's the regulatory obligations. And honestly, when I moved to Asia and I worked for Bank of America and JP Morgan, a lot of the projects that I was working were mainly regulatory. And I was like, well, that's boring. You know, nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to do some regulatory projects and write some spreadsheet access, whatnot. But in reality, compliance is very important to individuals, because until the software is in production, it's very much just REST APIs, data stores, and you have this synthetic data. You don't really care who's actually using that software. Once it's in production, you want to make sure that, okay, I want my account to only be accessible by my relationship management. I think that's a very good point. I don't want my neighbor, I don't want my, well, maybe my wife, my spouse, depending on the relationship, right? If you family ties, parents or whatnot. The same is, well, I really want to have that link encrypted. When I'm accessing the website or my iBanking, I really want to use one-time password. I want to have the encryption strengths. I really want to make sure that my finances are safe. And really, like, what is all about, you know, the data confidentiality, the privacy, the data residency, data sovereignty. These are actually policies that we humans really need in terms of using a usable system. You don't want to go on a retail system and see someone else's shopping cart. You don't want to go on a banking and see the balance is someone else, right? You don't want to see different statements. You want to make sure that actually it's being taken care. And that's really what is about making the applications production ready. So I want to stress in terms of the migrations to the cloud, often enough, and I've been doing it for close to 4 years now, in terms of migrating workloads to the cloud. And the first thing that you find is, like, first year, you have the support from the CIO, CEO, everyone builds the rockstar team, and you just like, get it done, push it to production. Just get it by any means. And what happens is, at the end of the year, after a lot of stress, tears and whatnot, you just like, here's the 5 applications to the production cloud. We did it. And it's like, well, here's 25 more. It's like, no, we didn't automate it. We just like forklifted it, or we shifted them on the cloud. And it's really the point where, when you are migrating to the cloud, it's not the end goal to have 5 or 10 or 15 applications in the cloud and like have a rubber stamp saying, this is cloud native, right? This is cloud ready, this is cloud friendly. It's really, do we have a process? Does it make sense? Is the team gonna scale the process? Do we have the right skills? Does it actually make sense? Because once you involve these production applications and you have data, you actually find out that Amazon is very cheap to get the data in, but it overcharges you when you want to get the backups, you want to get the data out, or do synchronization and a lot of other systems. So then it's like, well, why did we get into the it's not financially reasonable. So then we go into this governance and IT governance, what does actually mean? And I'll let you read, and I just want to pinpoint on what I mean compliance. So compliance ensures that an organization has the process and internal controls to meet the requirements imposed by the governance body. So if you're in Singapore and you're a Singapore customer, that's MAS for financial services. If you're in UK, that's PRA. If you are in US, that's Fed and FCC. So it's really important that they actually mean good. So if you've seen like the latest scandals in Facebook, and it's probably not the first, and that's going to be the last one, for exposing the data or actually changing the social fabric on where we build these relationships, right? And leaking the credentials, leaking the data that we really care and we've entrusted. So I think it's really important that we actually start building the software the right way. And don't look at the compliance as the last mile, where we'll just do some spreadsheet at the end of the year. We'll just pinpoint some PowerPoints and we'll just like get by. Instead, we actually build it into the process. And if you're like a big, you're a government agency or you're a corporate or like a multinational, so for example, Standard Chartered is in 62 markets, you actually see the synergy in building this common framework. We call it the Common Cloud Framework. And we start by saying, well, let's look at all the regulatory bodies that we have, and we do a baseline evaluation, and we see out of all the regulators, because they are actually responsible for the citizens, but they are not that diverse. So let's find the commonalities in terms of all the policies or all the facts that they actually want. Well, that's done. Then let's do the gap analysis between, well, what is Singapore interested versus Indonesia versus Hong Kong versus Korea. Then we start thinking in terms of, okay, so in terms of once we choose the pilot applications, as my friend Cote mentioned, we actually start looking in terms of what would be the minimum viable cloud services that we need to provide. Maybe a database, maybe an application service, a web service, maybe some sort of caching and some entitlements authorization. The next is we really need to do ongoing assurance and regulatory compliance. So if you don't invest in the automation, then you actually build that overhead. And that's very important to understand that if you are building on the cloud, you're actually building a platform. So you either buy the platform from someone else or you build it yourself, depending on how big the organization is. Code keeps eating the world. So I briefly mentioned about the quality assurance and how important it is in the CI/CD pipeline or in the DevOps space. How many of you actually write tests? If you can raise the hand. How many of you expect to actually do continuous integration? Everyone, right? So who writes the tests? How can you do continuous delivery if there is no testing for you and you're not able to assert what's the impact? And I think really 1994, Ken Beck, actually that's probably the biggest change that we have in the enterprise software. When we started looking in the quality assurance in terms of not just there's a QA team or a QA department, but building those responsibility into the design of our software. And it took a while, almost like 9 years, until Ken Beck published the book on the test-driven development by example. And that's really changed my career. I actually understood that I can capture the business requirements in these understandable specs, and I can write the code that passes that test, rather than going and browsing through like emails, spec documentations, BRDs, emails, having meetings, conversations. We actually start on this common language. The next, I think, the other phase was the introduction of behavioral-driven development, and it's like it's almost 10 years, to be honest. And that's really where we actually understood in terms of it's not just the responsibility of the development or QA, but we can capture those specifications way early in the cycle. And then not only can we capture, but we can actually collaborate. Has any one of you used Fitness? That was a hell of a product. That was a hell of a product. Wiki. How many of you are using Cucumber or Gherkin? Get on it. So if you're DevOps, it's really, if I would describe it, so you try to learn the operation space, and the operators learn the development practices. So you do source code control, continuous integration, writing tests, modular design. But both in the development space and in the operation space, you need to write tests, because otherwise you're actually gonna make it a personal issue, because you'll never agree. And that's where I think you have the Conway's Law, where the systems are being designed to replicate the team structure or the organizational structure. So just by writing the test and confirming the APIs between systems, you'll build a scalable platform. Okay, next. So with BDD and all the others, I think that's the best workflow that we started looking in terms of writing reliable enterprise software. So you begin with adding an acceptance test, and that can be applied not anymore just to the software or like your web or application services or database. Actually, that's the way we can do for our infrastructure, for our security, for our compliance, for our legal. It really starts with these easy steps, and we just need to find the people who would be responsible. So for example, in our case, when we are writing the compliance as code, we get with the compliance officers and we start communicating in the same terminology. And that's very important, because if you use different languages, like someone is writing a Word document and you're just like writing Java or not, there's not really collaboration, because you need to have a translator, right? And the problem with that, there's a lot of fidelity that is being lost in the context. And especially when you're working on infrastructure services or in the compliance space, context is everything. Are we going to stand up that infrastructure in Hong Kong versus we're going to stand up that infrastructure in Kenya? It's probably very different in terms of the end result. So let me read it through. You add an acceptance test, you run the acceptance test, it fails, you make a little change, you add the development test for the feature that you want to implement, you run the developer test, it fails, you make a little change, it passes, then you add that feature into the acceptance test, and the acceptance passed. Right? And you keep adding, so you're really moving from writing documentation, requirements, compliance, into having the code base as your most important, your data source of information. And that's really applicable to your infrastructure, to your compliance and operations. I'll add one more book to Matt's big list, Infrastructure as Code by Keith Morris, where it's really he going into a depth of how can you design the system and how can you codify your infrastructure. Anyone using Terraform? You should get on that. You should learn it. So in principle, what you do is you codify the environments, and then you build a pipeline between your dev, UAT, and production environment. And because that's modules of infrastructure, it's actually version controlled, and you write a pipeline to promote the environments from one stage to another, so you have the testing that does for you. And there's an example. So if you go to this link, there's a nice tutorial on how you can do it. So okay, back to our favorite cloud provider. So if you're going on the AWS, there is the diagram about shared responsibility for security. And it really looks like it's a half-half, or at least like they've already solved the problems for you. Well, let's take an example. If we look at the PCI DSS. Is anyone familiar with PCI DSS? Okay, I'll explain it. So that's a compliance standard for payments providers. So if you're using a credit card and you have a system that implements a payments gateway or credit cards or works with the customers in the financial services, you need to have the compliance standard. And if you look at it, really the only part that is being taken by AWS is this physical access where your environments are being held. So the rest of it is actually shared, which means that it's all part process, part APIs and services that you need to build. Another example, which is probably more detailed, and sorry for the small text, it's actually here only 23 controls. Actually, the list is 36, so there's many more. But this is how Cloud Internet Security has codified their benchmark and has established like specific rules. And you just, I think I have the link, but you literally can set up the config rules, and you'll have the policy and the security controls on AWS to pass that standard. It really shows you, think of it as your spec to implement the unit testing or the acceptance testing for the security. So once we saw and understood the context, it's quite big. So then the question is, so why automating it? Excel is enough. We have people. We can hire more people to do Excels and PDFs, and we can keep the conversation over emails. It's really important that we actually continuously monitor, because if you are running a production system with financial services, there's a lot of hackers. Do you know where So when I was building the mobile banking for one of the corporate banks, do you know where top #1 hackers were located?
South Korea.
Indonesia. And you know why? They actually, at the dams, they were setting up these small data centers, and they could move in the jungle, so you would never catch, you couldn't locate them. So they had like unlimited energy supply, and we just like couldn't reliably locate them. In South Korea, it's very easy. You just send the security. So ideally, what you do is you start looking at the audit logs, alarms, and you establish your baseline. Then you continuously do assessment, and you need to have the visibility, right? So you just need to see, are my systems safe? Are they compliant? And ultimately, you establish guardrails. And these guardrails, it's very much like your developer templates. So if we want to add another feature, let's say the mobile front end, or like another toggle in our mobile app, we just have the template, and you don't have to reinvent this over and over again for another mobile phone or another the service. So it's really the benefit in this automation is having the platform and the generic templates for you to build compliant software. I think a lot has been discussed in terms of what is the current state in our enterprises and how much legacy software do we have. The important part is probably, okay, thank you. It's really in terms of the foundations that we build our cloud native software. So you have the two axes. So one is opinions and then operational efficiency. So if you really want to build containers, you make a big trade-off, because then from operational efficiency, you are on the patching. So you have to patch your operating system, you have to update your JDKs, or if you're using any other runtime, you have to update your shared libraries and whatnot. Whereas if you're actually in the function as a service, that's probably the best case, because you are just handling the business requirements, you codify them, and then you can scale it. So that should probably be the holy grail. We should write more function as a service, and if you're not using Lambda or those, now is the time. It's going to be big. So what did we use for compliance? So we used AWS. We used AWS config and the config rules to do it. And if I would be very short, it's a lens on your AWS resources to monitor your control objectives. How did we build it? This is the diagram. So we had a specific compliance account with config rules and entitlements. And then we were able to run these Lambda functions for the resources. And then we'd set up scheduling. So we would run it every time there is a change, when we're provisioning new infrastructure or updating the application. And we would also do it on a hourly or 24-hour basis, just to understand what's the state. And we'll store it in a DynamoDB, and then we'll just have SNS topics to send alerts to whoever cares and needs to be informed. We actually done it with AWS, so this is on GitHub, we open sourced it. This is what it looks like a config. So if I am looking at identity access management for root multi-factor enabled, I basically get the resource, I look at the response. If the toggle account MFA enabled is not one, I just tag it as compliant, non-compliant, and then I have a compliance rule and I can remediate it. Because we're using Terraform, we started planning and doing a lot of our applying graph theory to our infrastructure, because we don't have one applications. We have hundreds and thousands of applications in different markets. We have countless systems from mainframe to the new and shiny software. So what we wanted to do in terms of an adoption governance, we said, like, as an application owner, I want to standardize the non-functional requirements for my applications running on the cloud. And then we just build these templates, we build these clients. We make sure that making compliant software is the easy thing to do. Because nobody, when it's working on a business application, says, I really care about compliance. I should implement, same about security and whatnot. So you need to make easy to do the right thing. So that's my acceptance test. I said, given a code repository and a set of approved design patterns, when a new valid design specification file is committed and the file is analyzed against an approved pattern, then design is approved and future releases can go to a pre-production environment. This can save you days, months in a continuous deployment environment. And it's really helping you to standardize your infrastructure, your platform. Okay, I'll skip here. That's a very good way to organize the team. Skip. I'll have 2 words about inspec. So we used AWS config. The interesting part was that that only applies for your cloud service provider, AWS specifically. So if you want to do it a hybrid cloud where you have on-premise, or you want to use something like Azure or Google Cloud, you actually have to reinvent the wheel. And that's why we're currently looking at a framework that can standardize our compliance profiles in a spec-like framework where we, again, back to the BDD and TDD, we can collaborate with the compliance and security on the same common language. And I think that's very important. That's how inspec sample rule looks like. So if I have a IAM access key or I want to describe my IAM policy, just literally the control that I write. It's very easy and it's actually readable, and someone who is non-technical can write those and most importantly review and approve. Because at the end of the day, you don't want someone who is, let's say in IT leadership to spend too much time. So they just need to be able to understand if there's a non-compliant rule, how can they remediate it and how can they make it safe. Questions? Thank you. I made it in time.
Any questions? All right. If you have questions, just drop your question in our pigeonhole.at/DevOpsDays, JKD, so we can discuss in the open space.
There's an open space for compliance as code. Definitely, it's probably boring. Right, I think I said multiple times in terms of, but so is security and many other things in terms of infrastructure as code. However, as we build production systems and we go beyond the hello world and the sample applications, that's really what will allow us to scale, and that will be the deciding factor. If you are fined for $1 billion and then you immediately think of, well, probably would have been good if we had some compliance as code. So ideally, if you are not a learning organization, you're probably losing to someone who is doing that. So have your pipeline, have your feedback loop, build your testing pyramid, add your security test and compliance, and make the iteration. And last, we are hiring system engineers and software engineers to work in Singapore. Thank you.